The truth is, it is very rarely the case that we choose that voice by default, that we have to lean in courageously and act upon it, that we have to, in many ways, become the coal miners of our own lives and not look at that pile of shit or that pile of work or that pile of potential and purpose with a sense of despair and dread and fear that we're not capable, that we're not worthy, that we're not deserving of turning it into art, and taking a big breath in, bending down, and getting at the digging. Dear Sugar, the truth. I am sick with panic that I cannot, will not, override my limitations, insecurities, jealousies, and ineptitude to write well, with intelligence and heart and lengthiness. And I fear that even if I do manage to write, that the stories I write will be disregarded and mocked. How do I reach the page when I can't lift my face off the bed? How does one go on, Sugar, when you realize you might not have it in you? How does a woman get up and become the writer she wishes she would be? Sincerely, Alyssa Bassist. Sugar's response. Dear Alyssa Bassist, when I was 28, I had a chalkboard in my living room. It was one of those two-sided wooden A-frames that stand on their own and fold flat. On one side of the chalkboard I wrote, "The first product of self-knowledge is humility," by Flannery O'Connor. And on the other side I wrote, "She sat and thought of only one thing, of her mother holding onto their hands," Eudora Welty. The quote by Eudora Welty is from her novel The Optimist's Daughter, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1972. It was a book I read again and again, and that line about the woman who sat thinking of only one thing was at the heart of the reason why. I sat like that too, thinking of only one thing that was actually two things pressed together, like the back-to-back quotes on my chalkboard. How much I missed my mother, and how the only way I could bear to live without her was to write a book. My book. The one that I'd known was in me since way before I knew people like me could have books inside of them. The one I felt pulsing in my chest like a second heart, formless and unimaginable, until my mother died, and there it was, the plot revealed, the story I couldn't live without telling. That I hadn't written the book by the time I was 28 was a sad shock to me. Of myself, I'd expected greater things. I was a bit like you then, Alyssa Bassist, without a book, but not entirely without literary acclaim. I'd won a few grants and awards, published a couple of stories and essays. These minor successes stoked the grandiose ideas I had about what I would achieve and by what age I would achieve it. I read voraciously. I practically memorized the works of writers I loved. I recorded my life copiously and artfully in my journals. I wrote stories in feverish, intermittent bursts, believing they'd miraculously form a novel without my having to suffer too much over it. But I was wrong. The second heart inside me beat ever stronger, but nothing miraculously became a book. As my 30th birthday approached, I realized that if I truly wanted to write the story I had to tell, I would have to gather everything within me to make it happen. I would have to sit and think of only one thing longer and harder than I thought possible. I would have to suffer, by which I mean work. At the time, I believed that I'd wasted my 20s by not having come out of them with a finished book, and I bitterly lambasted myself for that. I thought a lot of the same things about myself that you do, Alyssa Bassist, that I was lazy and lame, that even though I had the story in me, I didn't have it in me to see it to fruition, to actually get it out of my body and onto the page, to write, as you say, with intelligence and heart and lengthiness. But I'd finally reached a point where the prospect of not writing a book was more awful than the one of writing a book that sucked. And so at last, I got to serious work on the book. When I was done writing it, I understood that things happened just as they were meant to, that I couldn't have written my book before I did. I simply wasn't capable of doing so either as a writer or a person. To get to the point, I had to get to write my first book. I had to do everything I did in my 20s. I had to write a lot of sentences that never turned into anything and stories that never miraculously formed a novel. I had to read voraciously and compose exhaustive entries in my journals. I had to waste time and grieve my mother and come to terms with my childhood and have stupid and sweet and scandalous sexual relationships and grow up. In short, I had to gain the self-knowledge that Flannery O'Connor mentions in that quote I wrote on my chalkboard. And once I got there, I had to make a hard stop at self-knowledge's first product, humility. Do you know what that is, sweet pea? To be humble? The word comes from the Latin word humulus and humus, to be down low, to be of the earth, to be on the ground. That's where I went when I wrote the last word of my first book, straight onto the cool tile floor to weep. I sobbed and I wailed and I laughed through my tears. I didn't get up for half an hour. I was too happy and grateful to stand. I had turned 35 a few weeks before. I was 2 months pregnant with my first child. I didn't know if people would think my book was good or bad or horrible or beautiful, and I didn't care. I only knew I no longer had 2 hearts beating in my chest. I'd pulled one out with my own bare hands. I'd suffered. I'd given it everything I had. I'd finally been able to give it because I'd let go of all the grandiose ideas I'd once had about myself and my writing. So talented, so young. I'd stopped being grandiose. I'd lowered myself to the notion that the absolute only thing that mattered was getting that extra beating heart out of my chest, which meant I had to write my book, my very possibly mediocre book, my very possibly never going to be published book, my absolutely nowhere in league with the writers I'd admired so much that I practically memorized their sentences book. It was only then, when I humbly surrendered, that I was able to do the work I needed to do. I hope you'll think hard about that, honey bun. I'm skipping a bit. We get the work done on the ground level, and the kindest thing I can do for you is tell you to get your ass on the floor. I know it's hard to write, darling, but it's harder not to. The only way you'll find out if you have it in you is to get to work and see if you do. The only way to override your limitations, insecurities, jealousies, and ineptitude is to produce. You have limitations. You are in some ways inept. This is true of every writer, and it's especially true of writers who are 26. You will feel insecure and jealous. How much power you give those feelings is entirely up to you. How many women wrote beautiful novels and stories and poems and essays and plays and scripts and songs in spite of all the crap they endured? How many of them didn't collapse in a heap of "I could have been better than this," and instead went right ahead and became better than anyone would have predicted or allowed them to be? The unifying theme is resilience and faith. The unifying theme is being a warrior and a motherfucker. It is not fragility. It's strength. It's nerve. And if your nerve deny you, as Emily Dickinson wrote, go above your nerve. Writing is hard for every last one of us, straight white men included. Coal mining is harder. Do you think miners stand around all day talking about how hard it is to mine for coal? They do not. They simply dig. You need to do the same, dear, sweet, arrogant, beautiful, crazy, talented, tortured, rising star glow bug. That you're so bound up about writing tells me that writing is what you're here to do. And when people are here to do that, they almost always tell us something we need to hear. I want to know what you have inside you. I want to see the contours of your second beating heart. So write, Alyssa Bassist. Not like a girl, not like a boy. Write like a motherfucker. Yours, Sugar. And that is a section from the book Tiny Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar by Cheryl Strayed. It is a collection of anonymized letters that were published to Dear Sugar, Sugar being a columnist who was at the time publishing these and writing these responses to those letters anonymously, who later came out and named herself as Cheryl Strayed and created a book of, honestly, a series of truly tremendous letters and responses to questions that readers had written to her. I think we all have a second beating heart inside of us. Sometimes it takes years to find that heart. Sometimes it's something that I think we could die knowing is inside of us, but not knowing how to access or not having the courage to go in and rip out and present to the world. I think that's a choice. I think it's a choice to go in after that second beating heart in our chests and pull it out and see what it has to say, to listen hard and to share whatever it is that it is saying about what we should be while we're here. You know what I mean? It's not about writing a book. It's about finding the things that we know are calling us and listening and having the courage to hear what they want to tell us about who we are and who we should be, to have the courage to listen and to act on whatever it is that it is saying to us. I think a lot of times we get stuck in a humdrum, mediocre life. We have a lot of regrets. Ask any of the people who are dying. There's people dying all the time. Oh, I wish I went on this trip. I wish I wrote that book. I wish I quit my job. I wish I traveled the world. I wish I was a better father, a better husband, a better lover, a better friend. A lot of times we're going to have these sorts of regrets inside of us. And I don't think it's possible necessarily to reduce them all the way down to zero, because at the end of the day, at the end of the life, who's going to know what we're going to regret or not regret? I think in many ways it takes living out an entire life to know what we feel like we did right and what we feel like we did wrong. But at the same time that is true, I also do believe that we get clues and hints along the way. I think a lot of times we know, if we have the courage to just stop and listen to that voice in the back of our ears, which we all have, it's telling us something about the life that we're living, about the trajectory that we're on, about the path that we are choosing. And I hope that your voice says, you're doing great. You're exactly where you gotta be. Keep going. But I also know that the truth is, it is very rarely the case that we choose that voice by default, that we have to lean in courageously and act upon it, that we have to, in many ways, become the coal miners of our own lives and not look at that pile of shit or that pile of work or that pile of potential and purpose with a sense of despair and dread and fear that we're not capable, that we're not worthy, that we're not deserving of turning it into art, and taking a big breath in, bending down, and getting at the digging and becoming something that we want to be. You just got to bend down, pick up the shovel, and dig. Dig hard for that life. Dig hard for that purpose, and keep showing up day in and day out. There are plenty of days now when I come home from work and I am so tired, or I know that I'm writing a really painful story in my memoir, and it is so hard to sit down and be vulnerable with myself, to be naked on that page, to be staring at that reflection of who I am and how I had been hurt, looking back at me with disgust in some ways, with fear in others, with pain, lots and lots of pain. But I'm digging, because the pain that I choose is so much better than the pain that I don't. And that as hard as it is to write this damn book, as hard as it is to be the coal miner of all of our lives, what's even harder than that is to not do that work. Because let me tell you something, as I write this thing, I know that's damn fact. And I also know that I didn't know this until I was ready. And she talks about that in her response in the letter as well. She felt like a failure at 26 and 28 and having wasted her whole 20s, in quotes, not having written this book. But she wasn't ready until the moment that she was ready. She wasn't ready until her mother died and that story fell out of her and she said, this is what I have to write. Now I'm ready. And all of those journals and thoughts and short stories and essays that she had written and published and left in the graveyard of her half-baked, half-finished work, that wasn't useless. That was preparing her for the big monumental heft of her book, of her version of being a coal miner. So don't be discouraged if you don't know what that thing is yet. I say this now with a lot of conviction because I finally feel like I hit the ground floor of what I need to be working on, but I didn't know until I knew. I wasn't ready a moment before I was ready. So the best thing that you can do is honor that voice if you hear it, and if you don't hear it yet, it's okay, but just make sure you keep checking in with yourself, because it's going to start knocking louder and louder until you hear it, until you answer it. So answer it. Get the digging. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this space with me. I hope you enjoyed that section of the book as much as I did. And if this is the kind of thing that you enjoy and you liked it, I know this is a new thing. I've never shared writing from a book before and my reflections on it. Please let me know, because I had a lot of fun just doing this right now. And sometimes I struggle to make videos about my life because I'm just so in the flesh of feeling. And that's what happened to me this week when I read that section in that book. So let me know if you liked it, and I'll do more of these. With that being said, I'm going to wrap up the video here. Thank you so much for being here. If you like the video, then please drop it a like. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. I love you, and I will talk to all of you next week. Bye.